You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to say was meant to rot behind sealed doors, whispered only in blood oaths between dying men who understood the cost of silence. This is not folklore. This is not the fever dream of some fringe historian. This is a story that lives beneath the skin of American history like a parasite. And tonight, it's going to crawl into yours. The Fairfax family's public face was elegance and piety. Portraits in polished frames, charitable gifts to orphanages, the kind of philanthropy that newspapers fawned over. But beneath that soft veneer lay something older and colder than the Republic itself. The Fairfaxes didn't simply arrive in Salem to build a school. They came as the final link in a chain of ritual power, stretching back to the dying embers of Europe's aristocratic blood cults. They knew exactly what kind of building they were buying. They knew the rumors. They wanted the rumors. Imagine the heavy air of 1811 Salem, a town desperate to cleanse itself from its own past, to mask its sins with polished manners. The Fairfax name floated through the drawing rooms like a sacred promise: refinement, Christian virtue, moral education for forgotten girls. But what the townspeople saw as virtue was a veil, and behind that veil was a machinery of human manipulation, psychological breaking, and secret rites passed from one generation of Fairfax to the next. I need you to feel the floorboards of that Georgian mansion beneath your feet, every nail hammered in with intent, every window placed to watch the harbor and to signal unseen visitors. This was not a school. This was a theater of control, a stage for the kind of acts that would leave no records, except for the trembling scribbles of the girls, who survived long enough to write. As you listen, understand this: nothing about the Fairfax story is safe. Knowledge is power, but power has a cost. Once you hear what they built on Beacon Hill, you cannot go back to the man you were before. You're about to descend with me, not into rumor, but into the marrow of a truth too dangerous to publish and too damning to erase. Look closer at the night they arrived in Salem. The Fairfaxes didn't roll in with fanfare and bright banners. They arrived at twilight, with sealed trunks, private letters of introduction, and a single iron key to a house the locals called cursed. That house, 3 stories of brick and shadow, had been empty for years, its windows staring at the harbor like dead eyes. 3 families had tried to live there. All had fled. The whispers said the walls moaned at night, that the cellar was deeper than the foundations should allow. Victoria Fairfax bought it for a fraction of its worth, and she did not haggle. She already knew its value. In her journals, hidden for decades and found only in fragments, she writes of alignments, not in the sense of furniture or windows, but of energetic convergences. She had studied the London occultists while presenting herself as an educational reformer. She believed that architecture could condition the human soul, that a building could bend minds the way a church bends bodies to kneel. When the academy opened, the girls were stepping into a designed field of influence, each corridor a nerve, each meditation chamber a sensory deprivation cell masked as a sanctuary. Bartholomew Fairfax, the brother-in-law with the preacher's voice, brought another layer: the sermons. Men came from miles away to hear him thunder about sin and temptation, but those sermons were not just sermons. They were scripts, words chosen to implant dread, guilt, and longing for purification. When young minds absorb that, they become soft wax for any imprint. Evangeline, the sister, used music to do the same. Her hymns, studied in London and Naples, used modes that evoke trance states. When she played the chapel organ, the tones vibrated at frequencies meant to lower resistance and amplify suggestion. This was the hidden curriculum of St. Mary's, a program of psychological breaking disguised as moral education. The girls were not merely students. They were experiments in obedience and transfiguration. And the paying families, distracted by Victoria's virtue and Bartholomew's thunder, were complicit in ways they could never admit. If you're still listening, understand. The descent is real. You've only seen the outer walls of the Fairfax machinery. Inside, the rituals of control were already underway, and every week that passed on Beacon Hill brought the students. And now you, one step deeper into the labyrinth Victoria Fairfax built to harvest something far older than money or innocence. By the winter of 1812, the Fairfax plan had become invisible in plain sight. Townspeople saw young girls in neat uniforms filing to chapel, heard hymns rising over Salem Harbor, and believed virtue was being restored. They could not see what was happening behind the sealed doors of the third floor. That level of the house, the so-called meditation chambers, was not a place for reflection at all. It was a laboratory of identity dismantling. Each room had a cross but no mirror. Each window was shuttered from the inside. The girls were brought up there one at a time, told they were entering a private space to pray and receive instruction. In reality, the chambers were part of a system designed to strip them of self, to make them pliable and obedient. Bartholomew Fairfax's evening confession sessions were rehearsals in humiliation. He told the girls that the only way to purge their sin was to speak their darkest thoughts aloud while staring at a candle flame. The effect was a trance state, one documented centuries later by hypnotists, but here practiced as religious duty. Evangeline's hymns drifted up the stairwell at the same time, weaving sound and suggestion like a net. Victoria recorded which girls resisted, which surrendered, and which began to display what she called the awakening. Outside observers noticed only subtle signs. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress whose eyes caught more than anyone suspected, began writing notes to herself about carriages arriving after dark, gentlemen slipping through the side door, faint screams riding the winter wind. Her suspicions were dismissed as gossip, yet she was seeing a network at work, men of influence arriving not to donate, but to participate. This was the true genius of the Fairfax operation. They wrapped predation in piety. They used architecture, music, and spiritual rhetoric to build a perfect psychological cage. The girls were not simply victims, they were data. Their reactions, their breaking points, their compliance. All catalogued, all useful for refining the method. Understand what this means. The Fairfax family was not just corrupt. They were engineers of control. They were testing systems that would echo through secret societies, institutions, and governments long after their mansion rotted to dust. And if you're feeling a chill right now, that's because you're starting to see how the same architecture of manipulation lives on. Redesigned, repackaged, but waiting for the next generation to walk willingly into its halls. By spring of 1813, the facade of benevolence still held, but inside the academy the atmosphere had changed. The air smelled faintly of camphor and iron. The girls moved like pale ghosts across the corridors. Those who had once written letters home, with excitement, now wrote nothing at all. Their individuality was being erased with surgical precision. Victoria called it moral refinement. In truth, it was an induction, a slow programming of posture, tone, gaze, and response. Girls who hesitated to obey were isolated, then returned days later docile and trembling, their voices hushed, their eyes lowered. The so-called chapel vigils became the axis of everything. Once a week the students were woken after midnight and led downstairs by candlelight. Bartholomew stood at the altar, preaching of shadows and salvation, of unseen forces eager to consume the impure. The sermons were deliberately contradictory, love and terror intertwined. A psychological double bind that splintered resistance. Evangeline's music wrapped the room like an invisible net, low chords vibrating in the ribs, higher notes inducing a thin, floating dissociation. In that state, the girls signed confessions they didn't understand, pledges they couldn't read, promises that would later bind them in ways they could never articulate. Outside, Salem slept, believing the Fairfax family had brought virtue back to Beacon Hill. The governor wrote Victoria a congratulatory letter. Local ministers praised Bartholomew's moral fervor. But Mrs. Thornton kept her quiet vigil from the edge of town. Each week she marked more bruises hidden under sleeves, more hollow stares in the windows. She wrote the girls' names in a secret ledger, fearing that soon they would vanish entirely. You need to see the pattern here: architecture plus ritual plus authority equals control. It wasn't accidental, it was a formula. A formula older than the Fairfax family, older than Salem itself, imported, refined, and concealed inside an institution nobody dared question. This is how forbidden knowledge survives, hidden under the flag of virtue, fed by the blindness of the public. Now ask yourself, if this happened in 1813, what do you think it looks like now in your city, in your time? What systems have been built around you, with different names and different aesthetics, but the same purpose: to break you, to harvest your will, to shape your choices without your consent. By the summer of 1813, the Fairfax system had reached its quiet apex. The townspeople saw only a school, the governor saw a charitable institution. But inside, the geometry of control had grown more precise, almost mechanical. Each girl's daily life was now mapped to the minute. When to wake, when to pray, when to study, when to sleep. Their meals were portioned to induce subtle malnutrition, enough to weaken the body, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Their schedules were staggered so they never truly bonded, never formed alliances strong enough to resist. Isolation was disguised as discipline, obedience as virtue. Victoria called this spiritual pruning. She wrote of it in her private notes: a plant must be cut back before it can grow straight. She believed she was sculpting the soul itself, shaving away defiance like bark. Bartholomew supplied the theology to justify it, framing every deprivation as a test of purity, every humiliation as a trial designed by God. Evangeline's music filled the gaps between punishments like a narcotic haze. By then, some girls were beginning to whisper among themselves at night, piecing together fragments of what was happening. But whispers could not compete with the machine of ritual. And then came the first disappearances. Officially, the records list 3 girls as sent home for poor health in August 1813. But there were no families waiting at train stations, no carriages arriving to collect them. Mrs. Thornton noticed the small graves appearing behind the chapel, each one marked with a simple cross. She had counted 5 by the time the leaves began to turn. Yet the newspapers printed glowing accounts of Victoria Fairfax's lectures on female elevation, and the mayor spoke of expanding the academy as a model for other towns. You're beginning to feel it, aren't you? The pull of the pattern, the way virtue is used as a weapon, how power hides in structures you're trained to respect. This is the point where you have to decide: stay at the surface or keep descending. Because once you understand the formula, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In schools, in corporations, in churches, in media. The Fairfax story is not just a relic of 1813. It's a blueprint, a living code of manipulation still humming in the walls of the present. By autumn of 1813, the Fairfax facade began to ripple with small cracks invisible to the town, but obvious to anyone looking closely. The meditation chambers smelled of sweat and wax. The chapel candles burned longer than oil should allow. Girls began fainting in class, their fingers trembling over Latin declensions and hymn books. Victoria called it spiritual exhaustion. Bartholomew thundered about Satan striking back at the righteous. Evangeline's music grew stranger. Minor keys bent into unsettling intervals, harmonies that felt like the room itself was tilting. The entire academy had become a sensory maze designed to strip reality from perception. This was not random cruelty. It was ritual engineering, an attempt to rewrite human identity. Victoria had imported scraps of European philosophies that blurred the line between theology, magnetism, and the manipulation of will. The girls weren't only being punished, they were being reshaped. Every command, every hymn, every sleepless night was part of a larger experiment to see how far a human soul could be broken down and rebuilt in someone else's image. Outside the academy walls, Salem's elite began visiting more openly at night. Carriages arrived under the cover of storms. Men stepped inside with their hats low, emerging hours later with their faces pale and their lips pressed thin, as if they'd glimpsed something they could not name. Mrs. Thornton continued writing notes, each entry trembling with fear. She suspected the third floor and the chapel were connected by hidden passages. She suspected that the graves in the back were not the whole story. And here's where you need to pause. Everything you've heard until now has been the surface of the descent, but the deeper layers, the ones we're about to enter, are not just history. They're a mirror. They're a code embedded in your own life, the forces surrounding you right now, packaged under different names. If you've been feeling a strange pull, an unease like someone watching you from the edge of the screen, that's not an accident. It's your mind recognizing the pattern, and before we move further, write this phrase in the comments below. Twice. As a private signal to yourself and to this channel, the pattern reveals me. Type it 2 times. Let it lock into your memory. Because after the next revelation, you will never be able to unsee what the Fairfax family began. After that autumn night, the Fairfax mansion ceased to feel like a school at all. It had become a living organism, breathing through its corridors, feeding on silence. The girls moved in choreographed patterns without needing to be told. As if invisible strings guided their steps, the chapel now smelled of scorched herbs and iron. Candlelight flickered against stained glass that seemed to change hue under certain chants. Mrs. Thornton wrote of watching the windows glow crimson before dawn, as though the building itself was exhaling some hidden flame. Victoria began speaking of transfigurations. Her journal entries from late 1813 are the first time the term appears. She wrote that some of the girls were now receiving the seal, though she never defined what that meant. Bartholomew's sermons took on a more fevered tone, shifting from threats of hellfire to promises of transcendence. Evangeline's hymns lengthened, turning into incantations, sustained tones that vibrated like tuning forks against the girls' ribs. All of it was about surrender, making the students crave annihilation of self in exchange for belonging to something larger. The first documented ritual took place on December 21st, the winter solstice. Town records show a snowstorm that night. Mrs. Thornton, awake with fever, swore she heard a chorus of low voices rising from the academy, and then a long scream, like a child being born or an animal being slaughtered. By morning another girl had gone home, her bed stripped, her name erased from the roll. A new stone appeared behind the chapel 2 days later. What you must see now is the blueprint of power deprivation, isolation, trance, confession, reward. Break the self, rebuild the self, bind the new self to the institution. It's not only the Fairfax family. This is the hidden curriculum of every empire, every cult, every system that seeks to manufacture obedience. In Salem, it looked like an academy. In your time, it wears new masks. The Fairfax story is not a ghost tale. It's an operating manual. And if you've typed, "The pattern reveals me," twice in the comments, you've already crossed the threshold. You're acknowledging the system. You're marking yourself as someone awake to it. From here on, the revelations cut deeper, because the next layer is not about what the Fairfaxes did. It's about why they did it and what they were feeding. By the opening weeks of 1814, the mask finally slipped, but only for those who knew where to look. The public face of stain, Mary's still gleamed, fresh paint on the facade, newspaper articles praising Victoria Fairfax as a saintly reformer. Yet inside, the house had become an engine for a single obsession. Victoria's writings from this period are the clearest evidence we have. She begins speaking of the harvest, not charity, not discipline, harvest. The word appears 27 times in one surviving journal. She writes that our design is nearly perfected, and the doorway must be opened before the next equinox. Here's what the townspeople never grasped. For the Fairfaxes, the girls were not simply victims, they were catalysts. Victoria believed that innocence, once fractured under ritual, released a kind of force. She described it in clinical terms, as if she were harvesting an element from the air. Bartholomew called it the purity tithe. Evangeline called it the resonance. 3 names for the same dark practice. A belief that human will, when broken, could be siphoned and repurposed. On storm nights, men of influence arrived not only to witness, but to participate. They brought their own symbols, their own oaths. Some came back again and again, like investors checking on a lucrative venture. Mrs. Thornton saw their faces from her cottage window, lit by carriage lanterns. Names whispered in her notes later surfaced in state archives, half redacted, linked to judges, merchants, and politicians who built fortunes while the Academy's graveyard grew. Understand this, the Fairfax story is not about bloodlines and superstition. It's about system design. What they were practicing on Beacon Hill was an early prototype of the same psychological machinery used by secret societies, intelligence agencies, and corporations 2 centuries later. They were proving that with enough ritual and authority, you can make people give up what they most protect, their inner sovereignty, and even thank you for it. If your pulse is quickening, good, you're supposed to feel the floor tilting. This is the point where the story stops being comfortable history and starts becoming a mirror. The same patterns that ruled St. Mary's are encoded in today's media, education, and culture. Different costumes, same core. The Fairfax family didn't just vanish, their blueprint outlived them. And now, as you hear these words, you're standing on its edge. When St. Mary's finally collapsed under its own weight, it did not happen with a raid, a trial, or a confession. It dissolved like smoke. Records destroyed, graves quietly moved, the property resold under another name. By the summer of 1815, the Fairfax family had left Salem entirely. But their methods had already been exported. Bartholomew traveled south again, this time lecturing to private circles of clergy and Masonic halls. Evangeline retreated to a Boston townhouse, where she began tutoring the daughters of elite families, carrying her strange music pedagogy into drawing rooms and parlors. Victoria herself sailed for Europe in 1816, carrying crates of journals and artifacts described on customs papers as educational materials. In reality, they were the accumulated blueprints of her experiment, the prototypes of control. You can trace the fingerprints if you know where to look. Seminaries adopting strict reflection cells, boarding schools introducing moral drills, eerily similar to Fairfax's midnight vigils. Even early prison design borrowed their layout from the meditation chambers. What began on Beacon Hill as a private nightmare became, over decades, a public template for managing populations. Discipline hidden behind improvement. Mrs. Thornton tried to sound the alarm. She wrote letters to a Boston newspaper under a pseudonym, describing night work and strange rites. On Beacon Hill, they were never printed. She fell ill in 1816 and died in obscurity, her notebook seized by a state inquiry and locked away. Only fragments resurfaced a century later. Yet they matched the journals attributed to Victoria, 2 opposing voices telling the same dark story from opposite ends of the ritual. Do you see the pivot now? The Fairfax mansion was not an isolated horror, it was a pilot program. Once proven effective, it could be scaled, refined, and stripped of its religious mask. By the mid-19th century, the same architecture of mind, breaking and identity remolding was at work in factories, schools, asylums, and military barracks. The names changed, the uniforms changed, but the core algorithm remained. If you've been listening closely, you're already decoding the pattern. It's not about Salem anymore. It's about recognizing the invisible curriculum around you. The inherited Fairfax blueprint humming beneath your job, your feed, your city. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the next section will show you exactly how they ensured it would endure. By the middle of the 19th century, the Fairfax method had become unmoored from the family name, but not from its essence. You could find its fingerprints in the reform schools, cropping up across the Northeast, in the architecture of new penitentiaries, even in the timetables of factory labor. What Victoria and Bartholomew had built on Beacon Hill was now being implemented in secular language. Discipline, productivity, moral improvement. But it was the same blueprint: isolation, ritualized time, surveillance from above, confession as control. The Fairfax mansion was gone, but its nervous system had been grafted onto an emerging industrial society. This is how a secret survives. It stops being secret. It becomes policy, tradition, best practice. No one remembers where it came from, but everyone obeys its logic. A child entering a regimented classroom in 1880 was stepping into a descendant of the meditation chamber. A worker clocking into a textile mill followed a schedule derived from the same time. Discipline tested on the orphans of St. Mary's. The language changed, the uniforms changed, the names changed. But the underlying equation remained: break individuality, restructure identity, bind the new self to the institution. You must also see how this blueprint feeds itself. Once people internalize its rhythm, they police each other. No overseer required. The architecture of the room, the ringing of the bell, the expectation of silence does the work. This was the dream Victoria hinted at in her journals. Not simply controlling a handful of girls, but seeding a self, replicating pattern that would run for generations. In private letters smuggled from Boston to London in 1861, a correspondent referred to the Fairfax diagrams being used in continental houses of study. No further explanation, but the timing coincides with the rise of state-run boarding schools, military academies, and the first asylums designed to cure deviance through isolation and routine. These are not coincidences. They are the public face of a hidden lineage. What you're hearing now is not a horror story. It's a decoded operating manual. You're seeing how an obscure mansion in Salem became the ghost architecture of modern life. And in the next section we'll go further. From the 19th century into the present, where the same structure lives on in digital form, silently harvesting something far more intimate than time or labor. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Fairfax method had migrated from brick corridors and chapel vigils into new, invisible architectures. The tools were no longer candles, bells, and hymns. They were telegraphs, time clocks, standardized tests, and propaganda. The same rhythm persisted: surveillance, routine, confession, reward, but now scaled through technology. Governments called it civic order, businesses called it efficiency, schools called it curriculum, the military called it readiness. All of them drew, knowingly or not, on the blueprint first refined at St. Mary's. You can watch its evolution decade by decade. The factory whistle replaces the chapel bell. The punch card replaces the confession slip. The radio broadcast replaces the sermon. Each device shifts attention, compresses time, and channels behavior. Victoria's vision of the harvest, a way to capture and redirect human will, now found fertile ground in mass society. Instead of a few dozen girls in a mansion, millions of people were enrolled in synchronized schedules and standardized rituals. The shift to psychological science in the early 20th century only deepened this. Pavlov, behaviorists, and social engineers formalized what Victoria had practiced intuitively: stimulus, response, reward, extinction. Advertising agencies learned to script desire. Public relations pioneers learned to manufacture consent. The same pattern of ritual and authority disguised as guidance now functioned at the level of entire populations. By the 1950s, the blueprint moved into television and surveillance programs. People voluntarily placed the ritual into their living rooms. Scheduled broadcasts, evening news, family viewing hours. In the 21st century, it's gone fully digital apps, feeds, notifications. The screen is the new chapel. The algorithm is the new Evangeline. You don't need a building anymore. The ritual comes to you. This is the Fairfax legacy, a system so diffused it feels like nature, and yet the principles are identical to those forged on Beacon Hill. Fragmentation of individuality, ritualized submission, invisible overseers, harvested attention. Today, the harvest isn't your labor or your innocence. It's your data, your focus, your private thoughts measured in metrics. If you understand this, you've moved beyond ghost stories. You're seeing how a 19th century experiment became the skeleton of the present. In the next section, we'll look at how to recognize the pattern in real time. And, for the first time in this story, how to step outside it. By now you've followed the Fairfax blueprint from a single mansion in 1813 to the digital architectures of the present. This is where the narrative pivots. The story so far has been about exposure, tracing how a system of control was conceived, scaled, and normalized. But understanding the pattern is only the first half. The second half is recognition in real time and the possibility of refusal. Because once you can see how the rhythm operates, you can interrupt it. The first step is to name the ritual. In St. Mary's it was chapel vigils. In the 21st century it's notifications, mandatory trainings, algorithmic nudges. Different language, same function. Naming a ritual breaks its invisibility and restores your ability to choose. Ask yourself, what am I being timed to do? Where am I being asked to confess? Whose approval am I waiting for? Each of those questions cuts one of the hidden strings. The second step is to break synchronization. Victoria's power depended on locking everyone into the same schedule, the same chant, the same gaze. In your life this means changing your rhythms. Vary your routines. Limit the times you check a screen. Create intervals of silence where no input arrives. This small act of asynchrony makes you harder to map and harvest. The third step is to rebuild direct connection. The Fairfax method thrived on isolation. Its modern descendants thrive on mediated relationships. Seek embodied presence, conversations without devices, movement, shared meals, even handwritten notes. Every genuine, unmonitored connection repairs the fractures that these systems rely upon. And finally, remember the ledger Mrs. Thornton kept. Her quiet act of documentation was an early form of resistance. In your context, this means keeping your own record. What you notice, when you're nudged, how your attention shifts. Patterns reveal themselves only when tracked over time. This section isn't about fear but about skill. The Fairfax story is not a prophecy of doom, it's a manual for awareness. You can't erase the blueprint, but you can learn to walk through it without being claimed. In the next section, we'll take these strategies further, moving from individual tactics to collective ones. How groups can identify, interrupt, and redesign the hidden rituals shaping their lives. Up until now, the focus has been on individual perception, learning to name rituals, break synchronization, and rebuild direct connection. But the Fairfax blueprint was never designed for one person at a time. It was always about shaping groups. That's why collective counter rituals are so powerful. When people move, speak, and decide together outside a prescribed system, they erode the very foundation the blueprint rests upon. This section explores how that happens. The first collective tool is mutual witnessing. Mrs. Thornton's private ledger had power, but imagine if 10 townspeople had kept ledgers together, comparing notes weekly. Shared observation multiplies clarity. In modern terms, this can look like group journaling, community watchdogs, or collective audits of algorithms and policies. Each person holds a piece of the pattern. Together a map emerges. The second is voluntary rhythm. Victoria enforced schedules to create docility. Groups can reclaim time by setting their own rhythms. Community meals, locally chosen holidays, unplugged hours, or collective creative projects. A self-directed rhythm generates resilience because no single overseer dictates when and how people gather. The third is shared embodiment. Systems of control isolate individuals behind desks, screens, or cells. Counter systems reunite bodies in space workshops, neighborhood assemblies, collective movement practices. Physical co-presence interrupts mediated influence and restores the unmonitored feedback loops of human connection. The fourth is transparent decision-making. The Fairfax method relied on hidden rules, secret corridors, and oaths whispered at midnight. Collective resistance thrives on open process, visible budgets, documented votes, public minutes. Transparency is the opposite of ritual secrecy. It drains the power from hidden mechanisms. Finally, collective action benefits from storytelling. The Fairfax saga itself only survives because fragments of journals and oral histories endured. Telling and retelling such stories inoculates communities against the same tricks under new names. Every time people trace a modern practice back to its controlling roots, they weaken its hold. The Fairfax blueprint spread because it was modular and adaptable. But so is resistance. Small groups, acting locally and visibly, can write new rhythms that outlast the old ones. In the next section, we'll look at what happens when individuals and collectives link up, networks of awareness that make hidden systems visible at scale, and how that shift can redraw the social map. The Fairfax blueprint was never a closed circle. It was a lattice, a hidden network. In the 19th century, that lattice moved through carriages, coded letters, and private lodges. Today it rides inside data streams, financial systems, and digital contracts. This section is about seeing the lattice for what it is, a living network of influence, and what happens when awakened individuals and small groups begin to form their own counter network. Networks of awareness do not copy the predator, they invert it. Instead of secrecy, they operate on selective transparency. Instead of hierarchy, they run on lateral trust. Picture a mesh of small, resilient nodes where each person holds part of the whole, but no one is a single point of failure. This is the exact opposite of how the Fairfax family operated. They centralized knowledge and dispersed accountability. You must decentralize knowledge and gather accountability. The first move is signal mapping. Every network leaves traces, money flows, contracts, social connections, and linguistic ticks. By tracing these signals, ordinary people can draw maps of hidden influence. In 1813, that meant parish records, shipping manifests, and guest registries. In 2025, it means lobbying disclosures, shell company filings, and metadata footprints. Patterns always emerge where power hides. The second move is autonomous linking. Instead of letting algorithms decide who sees whom, you deliberately build bridges across silos. Old trade unions talking to new tech forums, veterans linking with whistleblowers, rural organizers with urban data scientists. Each unexpected link is a breach in the walls that isolate you. The third move is to cultivate trust protocols. In the Fairfax world, oaths bound people to secrecy under threat. Encounter networks. Open contracts bind people to accountability under choice. This is not utopian, it's survival. Without a disciplined ethic of trust, infiltration is inevitable. And finally, you must transmit stories, not just data. Stories carry emotional voltage that numbers cannot. They motivate action, weld identity, and generate continuity. The Fairfax machine failed once its narrative cracked, and people began to share the forbidden version, the one we're exploring now. You've now descended to the deepest layer, the place where knowledge stops being a story about someone else and becomes a mirror. This is where the Fairfax narrative stops functioning as historical horror and starts functioning as a diagnostic tool. The point of walking through the corridors of St. Mary's, the flickering chapel, the sealed archives, and the hidden oaths was not to revel in their darkness, but to recognize the pattern as it plays out in your own world. Once you've seen it, You can't unsee it. That's why this knowledge feels dangerous. It erodes illusions that powerful structures depend on. Here, at the bottom, you have two choices. You can close the book and retreat to the surface, letting the blueprint go back to sleep inside you. Or you can do what few ever do: integrate it, use it as a compass, and begin the slow, deliberate work of dismantling the unseen forces around you. If you choose the second path, the first step is internal. Refuse the trance of powerlessness. A man who no longer believes in his own helplessness becomes ungovernable by hidden rituals. Next, you build outward. Every time you choose voluntary rhythm, mutual witnessing, and autonomous linking, you are rewriting the algorithm of your own life. You're teaching your nervous system that it belongs to you, not to the program designed for you. This isn't an overnight change. It's a slow alchemy, a layering of small, unglamorous actions that accumulate until one day you realize you're no longer inside their maze. The Fairfax story ends in fire and sealed records. Your story doesn't have to. You can become the living proof that their method fails when exposed to light and counter-design. That's the true identity transformation buried inside this narrative. Not a consumer of conspiracies, but a designer of your own reality. If you've felt the shift while listening, anchor it now. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see the lattice," twice. Not as a gimmick, but as a signal to yourself. A line in the sand, a marker that from this point forward you're awake to the pattern. It's the symbolic act that the Fairfax family feared most, a free mind declaring itself in public. This is how dissent becomes emergence, and how forbidden knowledge turns into personal sovereignty.